The radio crackled with static before the desperate voice cut through the white noise like a knife. "Mayday, mayday. This is Cessna 4-7 Alpha. Engine failure over Cascade Ridge. Going down hard." If anyone can hear this, the transmission dissolved into electronic snow, leaving only the howling wind outside the Mount Baker Search and Rescue Headquarters. Sarah Chun's coffee cup froze halfway to her lips as she stared at the radio equipment. 23 years old, with calloused hands from years of rock climbing and eyes that had seen too many mountains and too many seasons, she knew that voice belonged to someone who had maybe minutes left to live. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The coordinates place the crash somewhere in the Devil's Backbone, a notorious section of Glacier where the ice twisted into crevasses deep enough to swallow buildings whole. Captain Mike Rodriguez burst through the door, his face already grim with the weight of impossible decisions. Behind him came the rest of the team, veterans with decades of experience written in their weathered faces and confident strides. They moved with the practiced urgency of people who saved lives for a living. But Sarah could see the doubt in their eyes when they looked at the topographical maps spread across the table. "Devil's Backbone," Rodriguez muttered, tracing the terrain. With his finger, "This is bad, real bad." Sarah stood up, her heart hammering against her ribs. "I can do it. I know that section better than anyone." The room fell silent except for the persistent static from the radio. 8 pairs of eyes turned to her, and Sarah felt the familiar weight of their skepticism. She'd been fighting this battle for 3 years, ever since she'd first walked into this building with her climbing certifications and rescue training credentials. Every time there was a dangerous mission, every time someone needed to go where others couldn't, she volunteered. And every time she was told the same thing. "Chen, you're not certified for Glacier rescue," Rodriguez said, his voice carrying the tone of someone who'd had this conversation before. "This isn't some weekend climb up Mount Pilchuck. That's a Class 5 technical rescue in whiteout conditions." "I've been training for this for 3 years," Sarah replied, keeping her voice steady despite the frustration building in her chest. "I know those glaciers better than anyone on this team. I've climbed every route, mapped every crevasse system, studied every weather pattern." Tom Wilson, the team's senior rescue specialist, shook his head. "Knowing terrain and executing rescue are 2 different things. You've got the technical skills, sure, but you don't have the experience." "Not for something like this." Sarah bit back her response. Experience. It always came down to experience. How was she supposed to get experience if they never let her try? She'd spent countless hours training, pushing herself harder than anyone else on the team, perfecting techniques that most climbers never attempted. She'd studied under some of the best mountain rescue specialists in the country, earned certifications that grown men with 20 years of climbing experience didn't have, but none of that mattered when the real emergencies came. The radio crackled again. "This is Cessna 4-7 Alpha. Still alive down here, but the aircraft is unstable. Position approximately 2 clicks northeast of Devil's Backbone marker 7. Pilot injured, passenger unconscious. Please hurry." Rodriguez grabbed the microphone. "Cessna 4-7 Alpha. This is Mount Baker Search and Rescue. We have your position. Help is on the way. Can you give us details on your injuries?" "Possible concussion, broken left arm, cuts and bruises. My passenger is a 70-year-old woman, unconscious but breathing. We're wedged in what looks like a crevasse, maybe 30 feet down. The plane is balanced on a ledge, but it's not stable. Every time the wind hits us, we slide a little more." The room erupted in tense discussion. Maps were pulled out, weather reports analyzed, equipment lists compiled. Sarah listened to the debate with growing frustration. They were talking about bringing in a helicopter, but the weather was deteriorating rapidly. They discussed sending a full team up the standard route, But that would take hours in these conditions. Every suggestion seemed to involve either impossible logistics or unacceptable delays. What about the north face approach? Sarah finally interjected. I could rappel down from the ridge, get to them in under 2 hours. Absolutely not. Rodriguez said without hesitation. That's a suicide mission. The north face is vertical ice in good weather. In this storm, it's impossible. It's not impossible, Sarah insisted. I've climbed it dozens of times. I know every anchor point, every route variation. I can get down there. Mike Chen, no relation despite the shared last name, looked up from the weather reports. Sarah, the wind speeds are approaching 60 miles per hour. The temperature is dropping below -20. Even if you could make the descent, you'd be hypothermic before you reach them. Sarah felt the familiar burn of being dismissed, of having her capabilities questioned, not because of her skills, but because of assumptions about what she could handle. She'd grown up in these mountains, learned to climb before she could drive, spent more time on technical routes than most of the team combined. Her father had been a mountain guide, her mother a wilderness medic. She'd been born into this world, trained for it, dedicated her life to it. But when it mattered most, when lives hung in the balance, she was still seen as the rookie who needed to prove herself. I'm not asking for permission, she said quietly. I'm telling you I can do this. The room fell silent again. Rodriguez studied her face, and Sarah saw something shift in his expression. For a moment, she thought he might actually consider it. Then his professional mask slipped back into place. Chen, I appreciate your enthusiasm, but this is a command decision. Wilson and Martinez will lead the standard approach. We'll have a helicopter on standby if the weather breaks. That's final. Sarah watched as the team began their preparations. Standard approach meant hiking 4 miles through chest-deep snow, then technical climbing up exposed rock faces that would be sheets of ice in these conditions. Even if everything went perfectly, they were looking at 6 hours minimum before they reached the crash site. 6 hours while a plane balanced precariously on a ledge, with an unconscious elderly woman and an injured pilot fighting hypothermia. She slipped out of the room while the others focused on their gear checks. The equipment storage was adjacent to the main briefing area, and Sarah knew its contents better than her own closet. She'd maintained most of this gear personally, checking and rechecking every piece of hardware, every rope, every emergency device. Her hands moved automatically, selecting what she needed. Dynamic rope rated for glacier rescue, ice screws, protection hardware, emergency medical supplies, avalanche beacon, emergency shelter. The technical rescue pack was heavier than her usual climbing gear, but she'd trained with this exact load countless times. The weight distribution was perfect, every piece of equipment positioned for maximum efficiency. She'd spent hours perfecting her system, knowing that seconds could mean the difference between life and death in a real rescue situation. As she finished her preparations, Sarah caught sight of herself in the mirror mounted on the storage room wall. She looked like every other member of the team, professional, prepared, confident. But she knew that when the others looked at her, they saw something different. They saw someone who hadn't proven herself yet, someone who might crack under pressure, someone who needed to be protected rather than trusted. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd spent 3 years trying to prove she belonged on this team, and now she was about to prove it by defying their orders. If she was wrong, if she failed, it would validate every doubt they'd ever had about her capabilities. But if she was right, if she could save those people when the official plan couldn't, maybe she'd finally earn the respect she'd been fighting. 4. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from her younger brother Danny. Saw the news about the plane crash. Stay safe out there. She smiled grimly. Danny was the only person who never questioned her abilities, who'd grown up watching her push limits that most people couldn't even imagine. He'd been there for every training session, every practice rescue, every moment of doubt when she wondered if she was fooling herself about her capabilities. She typed back quickly, "Always do, love you too." The radio in the main room crackled again, and Sarah paused in her preparations to listen. The pilot's voice was weaker now, strained with pain and cold. "Mount Baker Search and Rescue, this is 4-7 Alpha. The wind is getting stronger. We've slipped maybe 10 feet further down. I don't think we have much time." Rodriguez's voice came through clearly. 4-7 Alpha, we have a team moving to your position. Eta, approximately 6 hours. Do you have any emergency supplies? Some. Blankets, a first aid kit, half a thermos of coffee. Not much else. My passenger is still unconscious. Her breathing seems shallow. 6 hours. Sarah closed her eyes and visualized the terrain between the rescue headquarters and the crash site. The standard route would take the team through the lower valley, then up the established climbing routes on the south face. Safe, predictable, and far too slow for someone who might not survive another hour. The north face approach was different. Dangerous, technical, requiring skills that few climbers possessed, but it was also direct. From the ridge above the Devil's Backbone, she could rappel straight down to the crash site. 2 hours, maybe less if conditions were favorable. Sarah finished her equipment check and headed for the door. She paused at the threshold, looking back at the team still huddled around their maps and weather reports. These were good people, experienced rescuers who'd saved countless lives. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. They weren't trying to exclude her out of malice or prejudice. They were trying to protect her, to keep her safe until she'd proven herself according to their standards. But their standards were going to get someone killed today. She slipped out into the storm, her boots crunching on the fresh snow that had accumulated in just the past hour. The wind hit her like a physical force, driving ice crystals into her face with stinging intensity. This was the kind of weather that turned mountains into killers, that claimed experienced climbers who made single mistakes or pushed just a little too hard. Sarah had been climbing in conditions like this since she was 15. Her father had taken her out in storms that kept other climbers safely indoors, teaching her to read weather patterns, to understand how wind and snow and temperature combined to create deadly hazards. She'd learned to move efficiently in whiteout conditions, to trust her instruments and her instincts when visibility dropped to arm's length. The drive to the trailhead took 45 minutes through worsening conditions. Sarah's truck was equipped for mountain rescue work, with tire chains, emergency supplies, and communication equipment. She'd made this drive hundreds of times, but never with such urgency weighing on her shoulders. As she parked at the snow-covered trailhead, Sarah tried to calculate the odds. The north face route was technical but straightforward. The weather was dangerous but manageable for someone with her skills. The real variable was the crash site itself. If the plane was as unstable as the pilot suggested, she'd need to work quickly and precisely to get both survivors out safely. She shouldered her pack and started up the trail, her headlamp cutting through the swirling snow. The familiar rhythm of climbing helped calm her nerves. Breathe, step, maintain steady progress without overexertion. The trail disappeared. Within a few hundred yards, buried under fresh snow, but Sarah knew these mountains well enough to navigate by feel and instinct. The first mile was relatively gentle, following the summer hiking trail through dense forest. Snow loaded the branches overhead, creating a tunnel-like effect that provided some protection from the wind. Sarah made good time, her conditioning evident in her steady pace despite the challenging conditions. As she climbed higher, the forest began to thin, and the full force of the storm hit her. Wind speeds that had seemed manageable at the trailhead became a constant battle. Each gust threatened to knock her off balance, and the snow was falling so heavily that it accumulated on her pack and shoulders faster than she could brush it off. Sarah paused at a familiar landmark, a distinctive rock formation that marked the halfway point to the tree line. Her GPS confirmed her position, and she was ahead of schedule despite the conditions. The radio clipped to her packstrap crackled with occasional transmissions from the main rescue team, but she kept the volume low. She didn't want to announce her presence until she was too committed to be called back. The terrain began to steepen. As she approached the tree line, what had been a hiking trail became a scramble over snow-covered rocks and fallen logs. Sarah's hands were already numb despite her insulated gloves, and ice was forming on her face mask where her breath condensed and froze. She reached the tree line just as the radio crackled with an urgent transmission. 4 to 7 Alpha, we're showing deteriorating weather conditions. How are you holding up? The pilot's response was barely audible through the static. Getting colder. My passenger hasn't regained consciousness. I'm having trouble staying awake myself. Sarah increased her pace. Hypothermia was setting in, and once it reached a certain point, it became a rapidly accelerating spiral toward death. She'd seen it before in training scenarios, watched as perfectly healthy people became confused, sluggish, and eventually comatose. As their core body temperature dropped, above the tree line, the world transformed into a monochrome landscape of white and gray. The wind was stronger here, unimpeded by forest, and it drove snow horizontally across the exposed slopes. Sarah's face mask was completely covered with ice, and she had to clear her goggles every few minutes to maintain visibility. The route to the ridge required technical climbing now, not just hiking. Sarah pulled out her ice axe and began the careful process of ascending steep, snow-covered terrain. Each step had to be precisely placed, each handhold tested before committing her weight. A fall here would be catastrophic, sending her tumbling hundreds of feet down the mountain. Her training took over, muscle memory guiding her movements even. As the storm tried to erase all visual references, she'd climbed this route so many times that she could navigate it by feel, recognizing the subtle changes in slope angle and rock formations, even under layers of snow and ice. The radio crackled again, this time with Rodriguez's voice. All units, be advised that Sarah Chen is not accounted for. Vehicle missing from headquarters parking area. If anyone has contact with Chen, please respond immediately. Sarah smiled. Grimly, they'd discovered her absence. Soon they'd figure out what she was attempting, and then the real arguments would begin. But by then, she'd be too far committed to turn back. Sometimes the only way to prove you could do something was to do it. She reached the technical crux of the route, a near vertical section of rock and ice that required precise footwork and upper body strength. In summer, this would be a moderate rock climb. In winter conditions, it became a test of ice climbing skills and mental fortitude. Sarah had climbed this section dozens of times, but never in conditions this severe. The ice was solid, which was good news. Rotten ice would have made the climb impossible. Sarah placed her ice tools carefully, testing each placement before committing her weight. The rhythm of ice climbing was different from rock climbing, requiring more deliberate movements and greater attention to the quality of each hold. She moved steadily upward, her world narrowed to the immediate task of finding the next handhold, the next foothold. The storm raged around her, but she'd learned to compartmentalize external distractions. There's only the ice, the tools, and the steady progression toward the ridge. As she neared the top of the technical section, Sarah's radio crackled with a new voice. Sarah, this is Rodriguez. I don't know if you can hear this, but if you're attempting what I think you're attempting, turn around now. That's an order. Sarah paused in her climbing, hanging from her ice tools while she considered her response. She could turn around. She could descend safely back to the trailhead, face the consequences of her insubordination, and let the official rescue team handle the situation. It would be the safe choice, the expected choice. But down in that crevasse, 2 people were dying while she had the skills to save them. She keyed her radio with a numb finger. "Rodriguez, this is Sarah. I'm committed to the north face approach. ATA to crash site, approximately 90 minutes. The response was immediate and heated. "Sarah, you are not authorized for this mission. Return to base immediately. That's a direct order." "Can't do it, Captain. Sorry." She turned off the radio and clipped it back to her pack. There would be time for recriminations later. Right now, she had a job to do. The final pitch to the ridge required everything she had. The wind was fierce enough to lift her off her feet if she wasn't careful, and the ice was forming faster than she could clear it from her equipment. Sarah's movements became more deliberate, more conservative. This was not the time for spectacular climbing. This was the time for solid, reliable technique. She hauled herself over the final edge and onto the ridge, immediately seeking shelter behind a rock formation. The wind was incredible up here, easily 70 miles per hour, and the snow was falling so heavily that she could barely see her own hands. But she'd made it to the launching point for her descent. Sarah pulled out her topographical map and GPS, cross-referencing her position with the reported crash site. The coordinates placed the aircraft approximately 600 feet below her current position, down a nearly vertical ice face. In good conditions, it would be a challenging rappel. In these conditions, it would be one of the most difficult technical rescues ever attempted in this region. She began setting up her anchor system, the most critical component of any rappel. The anchors had to be absolutely solid, capable of supporting not just her weight, but the dynamic forces generated by a rescue operation. Sarah chose a combination of ice screws and rock protection, creating a multi-point anchor system that would remain secure even if individual components failed. The process took 30 minutes in the howling wind, her hands barely functional despite the insulated gloves. Every piece of hardware had to be checked and double-checked, every connection tested and verified. There would be no room for error once she committed to the descent. As she prepared her rappel device, Sarah allowed herself a moment to consider the magnitude of what she was attempting. She was about to descend 600 feet of vertical ice in near whiteout conditions to reach a crash site that might be impossible to locate. She would be operating alone with no backup, no communication with the outside world, and no possibility of retreat if something went wrong. But down there, people were dying. People who could be saved if someone had the skills and the courage. To try, Sarah clipped into her rappel system and approached the edge of the ridge. The wind immediately tried to blow her sideways, and she had to lean into it to maintain her balance. Below her, the ice face disappeared into a gray void. She couldn't see the bottom, couldn't see the crash site, couldn't see anything but swirling snow and ice. She pulled out her avalanche beacon and switched it to search mode. If the aircraft had any electronic system still functioning, she might be able to get a bearing on their location. The device immediately began beeping, indicating a signal somewhere below and to the east. Sarah adjusted her position, aligning herself with the beacon's directional indicator. The crash site was down there, approximately 600 feet below and maybe 200 feet to the east. She'd have to execute a diagonal rappel, something that required precise rope management and constant attention to her position. She tested her rappel device one final time, checking the brake system and backup safety mechanisms. Everything was functioning properly. The ropes were rigged correctly, the anchors were solid, and her equipment was ready. The radio crackled faintly through the storm. She could hear Rodriguez's voice, increasingly desperate, calling for any contact with her. Position. The main rescue team was probably still miles away, fighting their way through the storm on the standard route. By the time they reached the crash site, it would be too late. Sarah took a deep breath, tasting the metallic bite of snow and ice. This was it. This was the moment she'd been training for, the test that would either prove her capabilities or destroy her career. Everything she'd worked for, everything she'd dreamed of, came down to the next few hours. She leaned back over the edge, her weight transferring to the rappel system. The rope held, the anchors held, and she began her descent into the storm. The wind immediately grabbed her, trying to slam her into the ice face, but she'd anticipated this and adjusted her technique accordingly. The world became a narrow tunnel of focus. There was the rope, the ice, the constant adjustment of her position to maintain control. The avalanche beacon continued to beep, guiding her toward the crash. Sight, but she couldn't see more than a few feet in any direction. Sarah descended steadily, her movements controlled and precise despite the extreme conditions. This was technical climbing at its most demanding, requiring absolute concentration and flawless technique. Every rappel anchor had to be perfect. Every rope management decision had to be correct. Every movement had to be deliberate. The beacon's signal grew stronger as she descended, and she began to make out shapes in the swirling snow below. There was something dark against the white ice, something that didn't belong in the natural landscape, the aircraft. She was close now, maybe 50 feet above the crash site. The plane was wedged into a narrow crevasse, just as the pilot had described, balanced precariously on a ledge of ice. It was a miracle the aircraft hadn't fallen deeper into the glacier, but Sarah could see that the position was unstable. The wind was strong enough to move the wreckage, and each gust caused it to shift slightly. Sarah adjusted her descent, aiming for a position where she could reach the aircraft without destabilizing it further. The crevasse was narrow, maybe 20 feet wide, with sheer ice walls on both sides. The plane was wedged about 30 feet down from the surface, accessible but dangerous. She could see movement inside the cockpit now, a figure waving weakly at her approach. The pilot was alive, conscious, and aware of her presence. That was good news. The passenger remained motionless, visible through the passenger window, but showing no signs of awareness. Sarah reached the level of the aircraft and began the delicate process of setting up a rescue anchor system. She needed to create a stable platform for the evacuation, something that would support the weight of multiple people while remaining secure if the plane shifted position. The ice quality was good, solid enough to support ice screws, and reliable enough for technical rescue work. Sarah worked quickly but carefully, placing protection and rigging rescue lines while the storm continued to rage around her. As she worked, she could hear the pilot calling to her through the aircraft's damaged door. "Thank God you're here. I didn't think anyone could make it down in this weather." Sarah looked up from her anchor placement and saw the pilot clearly for the first time. He was maybe 40 years old, with a face marked by pain and exhaustion. His left arm was clearly broken, held against his body with a makeshift sling, and there was dried blood on his forehead from what looked like a significant head injury. "I'm Sarah Chen with Mount Baker Search and Rescue," she called back, her voice barely audible over the wind. "How are you holding up?" "Been better," the pilot replied with a weak smile. "Name's David Walsh. My passenger is Eleanor Martinez, 73 years old. She was unconscious when we crashed and hasn't come around since. I'm worried about her." Sarah nodded, finishing her anchor system and beginning the process of accessing the aircraft. The door was jammed, probably from the impact, but she had tools designed for vehicle extrication. Getting the survivors out was going to be the easy part. Getting them up 600 feet of vertical ice in a blizzard was going to be the challenge. She worked methodically, using her training and experience to assess the situation and develop a rescue plan. The aircraft was unstable but not immediately dangerous. The pilot was injured but mobile. The passenger was unconscious but breathing. The weather was terrible but manageable. Sarah had trained for scenarios exactly like this. She knew the procedures, had practiced the techniques, understood the risks. What she hadn't anticipated was the overwhelming sense of responsibility that came with being the only person who could save these lives. As she prepared to begin the extraction process, Sarah's radio crackled with a transmission from the main rescue team. "All units, this is Rodriguez. We're still approximately 4 hours from the crash site. Weather conditions are deteriorating rapidly. Any updates on Chen's position?" Sarah keyed her radio, her voice steady despite the circumstances. "Rodriguez, this is Sarah. I'm at the crash site. 2 survivors, both alive. Beginning extraction procedures now." The response was immediate and intense. "Sarah, do not attempt extraction without backup. Repeat, do not attempt extraction without backup. We'll be there as soon as possible." "Negative, Captain. Survivors are hypothermic and deteriorating. I'm beginning extraction now." She turned off the radio again and focused on the task at hand. The main rescue team was hours away, and these people didn't have hours. They had minutes, maybe less if the hypothermia continued to progress. Sarah began the delicate process of extracting the survivors from the crashed aircraft, knowing that everything she'd trained for, everything she'd dreamed of, came down to the next few hours. She was alone on a glacier, 600 feet below the nearest help, with 2 lives depending entirely on her skills and determination. The storm showed no signs of letting up, and the light was beginning to fade as afternoon moved toward evening. Soon she'd be working in complete darkness, with nothing but her headlamp to illuminate the rescue operation. But Sarah Chen had been preparing for this moment her entire life. She'd been refused mountain rescue training, dismissed as too inexperienced, too young, too unproven. Now, as she began the most challenging rescue of her career, she was about to prove that sometimes the most unlikely person is exactly who you need when everything is on the line. The real test was just beginning. The aircraft groaned ominously as another gust of wind slammed into the exposed fuselage, causing it to shift several inches deeper into the crevasse. Sarah felt her stomach drop as she watched the plane settle into an even more precarious position, the tail section now hanging completely unsupported over what appeared to be a bottomless chasm. Ice crystals showered down from above as the movement destabilized the surrounding glacier, and she realized with growing urgency that they had maybe 30 minutes before the entire aircraft would slide beyond reach. David Walsh pressed his face against the cracked cockpit window, his eyes wide with terror as he felt the plane lurch beneath him. "It's moving," he called out, his voice tight with controlled panic. "Every time the wind hits us, we slide a little more. I don't think this thing is going to hold much longer." Sarah worked frantically to set up her extraction system, her hands moving with practiced efficiency despite the numbing cold. The rescue harnesses had to be rigged perfectly on the first attempt. There would be no second chances if the aircraft shifted again. She pulled out her medical kit and assessed the situation through the damaged passenger window. Eleanor Martinez remained unconscious, her breathing shallow and irregular, her lips tinged blue with hypothermia. The elderly woman's pulse was weak but steady when Sarah managed to reach through the broken window to check her vitals. "Mrs. Martinez has been out for almost 3 hours now," David explained, wincing as he tried to shift position with his broken arm. "She was conscious right after the crash, said her name, and asked if I was okay. Then she just closed her eyes and hasn't responded since. I've been trying to keep her warm, but there's not much I can do." Sarah nodded grimly as she continued her assessment. Eleanor was showing classic signs of moderate to severe hypothermia, unconsciousness, slow pulse, barely detectable breathing. Without immediate medical intervention and aggressive rewarming, the woman would die within the hour. The broken arm was David's most obvious injury, but Sarah could see signs of a concussion in his dilated pupils and the way he occasionally lost focus during their conversation. The extraction would have to be done in stages. Sarah couldn't safely manage both patients simultaneously, especially given the unstable position of the aircraft. She would have to choose who to evacuate first, a decision that could determine who lived and who died. Every rescue manual she'd ever studied emphasized the importance of triaging casualties, but the clinical guidelines felt meaningless when she was looking at two real people whose lives hung in the balance. Eleanor's condition was more critical, but she was also completely helpless. David could potentially assist in his own rescue, despite his injuries. From a tactical standpoint, evacuating the mobile patient first made sense. But from a medical standpoint, the unconscious woman was dying faster. Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, trying to think through the decision with the same analytical approach she'd learned in her training. "David, I need you to listen carefully," she said, making her choice. "I'm going to get Mrs. Martinez out first. Her hypothermia is more advanced and she needs immediate medical attention. Once I get her secured and stable, I'll come back for you. Can you hold on for another 20 minutes? David nodded, though Sarah could see the fear in his eyes. Being left alone in the unstable aircraft while the wind continued to batter the wreckage took tremendous courage. "Do what you need to do. I'll be here." Sarah began the delicate process of accessing the passenger compartment. The door on Eleanor's side was completely jammed, crumpled by the impact and frozen solid by the accumulating ice. She would have to extract the woman through the pilot's side, which meant moving her across David's position. Every movement risked destabilizing the aircraft further, but there was no alternative. She managed to force open the pilot's door after several minutes of careful work with her rescue tools. The hinges protested with metallic groans, and more ice cascaded down from the disturbed surfaces above. David helped as much as he could with his good arm, but the broken limb severely limited his mobility. Sarah could see the pain in his face every time he moved, but he never complained or asked her to slow down. Getting Eleanor into a rescue harness while she remained unconscious proved to be one of the most challenging technical problems Sarah had ever faced. The woman was completely limp, a dead weight that had to be maneuvered carefully through the cramped cockpit. Sarah had to support Eleanor's entire body weight while simultaneously rigging the harness system, all while maintaining her own precarious position on the edge of the crevasse. The rescue harness was designed for conscious patients who could assist in their own evacuation. Adapting it for an unconscious person required improvisation and creative rigging. Sarah used additional webbing to create a full-body support system that would distribute Eleanor's weight evenly and prevent injury during the ascent. The process took precious minutes, and she could feel David's anxiety increasing with each delay. "She's really cold," David observed as Sarah worked. "I mean really cold. I could feel it through her clothes when I was trying to keep her warm. Is that bad?" Sarah didn't answer immediately, focused on securing the final connection points of Eleanor's harness. The truth was that the woman's core temperature had dropped to dangerous levels. Even with immediate evacuation and aggressive medical treatment, her chances of survival were uncertain. But David didn't need to hear that assessment right now. "Hypothermia is serious, but it's treatable," she finally responded. "The important thing is getting her warm and getting medical attention as quickly as possible." Once Eleanor was secured in the rescue system, Sarah faced the next challenge: how to safely extract her from the aircraft without causing it to shift position. The plane was balanced so precariously that removing Eleanor's weight might actually destabilize it further. Sarah needed to create a counterbalance system that would maintain the aircraft's current position while she evacuated the passenger. She rigged an additional anchor point on the opposite side of the crevasse, using ice screws and snow anchors to create a stable platform. Then she set up a complex pulley system that would allow her to control Eleanor's ascent while maintaining tension on the aircraft to prevent it from sliding. The system was more complicated than anything she'd practiced in training, but the principles were sound. Sarah tested her rigging carefully, applying gradual tension to ensure that all the components would hold under load. The ice anchors were solid, the rope systems were properly configured, and the pulley mechanisms operated smoothly. She had created a functioning rescue system under some of the most challenging conditions imaginable. The actual extraction process was terrifyingly delicate. Sarah had to ease Eleanor out of the cockpit while simultaneously managing the rope systems and monitoring the aircraft's stability. Every movement was calculated, every adjustment precise. The woman's unconscious body was awkward to maneuver, and Sarah found herself supporting Eleanor's full weight several times when the harness system shifted unexpectedly. David watched the process with obvious anxiety, his face pale with pain and stress. "Be careful," he kept saying. "Please be careful." As Eleanor cleared the aircraft, Sarah felt a moment of relief. The first phase of the extraction had been successful. But that relief was short-lived as she realized the magnitude of the challenge that lay ahead. She now had an unconscious hypothermia victim hanging in a rescue harness 30 feet down in a glacier crevasse, with 600 feet of vertical ice between them and safety. The ascent would require a complex mechanical advantage system to manage Eleanor's weight. Sarah couldn't simply haul the woman up hand over hand. The distance was too great and the load too heavy. She needed to set up a series of anchor points and pulley systems that would allow her to raise Eleanor in stages, resting at intermediate positions to manage her own fatigue and adjust the rigging as needed. Sarah clipped Eleanor's harness to her own system and began the ascent, using a technique called short hauling that allowed her to raise the unconscious woman while climbing simultaneously. It was exhausting work that required constant attention to rope management and anchor placement. Every 20 feet, she had to stop and set up a new belay station, transferring Eleanor's weight to temporary anchors while she prepared for the next section of the climb. The storm continued to rage around them, making every aspect of the rescue more difficult. Snow accumulated on the ropes, making them heavy and unwieldy. Ice formed on all the metal hardware, requiring constant maintenance to keep the systems functioning. The wind threatened to blow them off course or slam them into the ice walls of the crevasse. Eleanor remained unconscious throughout the ascent, her body limp and unresponsive. Sarah monitored her breathing and pulse whenever she stopped to rest, but the woman's condition continued to deteriorate. Her core temperature was dropping despite Sarah's efforts to insulate her with emergency blankets and body heat. Time was running out. The physical demands of the rescue were pushing Sarah to her limits. Hauling an unconscious person up 600 feet of vertical ice while fighting severe weather conditions was beyond anything she'd attempted in training. Her muscles ached, her hands were numb with cold, and her lungs burned from the exertion at altitude. But she refused to slow down or take extended rest breaks. Eleanor's life depended on speed. Halfway up the face, Sarah encountered a section of rotten ice that forced her to find an alternative route. The planned anchor points were unusable, and she had to traverse laterally across the face while supporting Eleanor's weight. The deviation cost precious time and energy, but there was no safe alternative. She couldn't risk placing anchors in unreliable ice, not with a person's life hanging literally in the balance. As they climbed higher, Sarah began to worry about her own condition. The cold was affecting her judgment and motor skills, and she found herself making small mistakes that she would never make under normal circumstances. Hypothermia was insidious, slowly degrading mental function until critical errors became inevitable. She forced herself to slow down and double-check every decision, every anchor placement, every rope management technique. The radio clipped to her harness had been silent for most of the ascent, but as they neared the 400-foot mark, it crackled to life with an urgent transmission. "Sarah, this is Rodriguez. We've reached the ridge above your position. We can see your lights. What's your status?" Sarah was so surprised to hear the transmission that she nearly dropped her ascender. The main rescue team had made much better time than anyone had anticipated, probably pushing themselves beyond safe limits to reach her position. Having backup available changed everything about the tactical situation. "Rodriguez, this is Sarah," she responded, her voice hoarse from shouting over the wind. "I have one patient secured and ascending. Female, approximately 70 years old, severe hypothermia, unconscious. Second patient still at the crash site, male, broken arm and possible concussion, stable but needs evacuation." "Copy that, Sarah. We're setting up a hall system from the top. Can you transfer your patient to our lines?" Sarah looked up toward the ridge, where she could now see the faint glow of headlamps moving in the storm. The cavalry had arrived, but she was still 200 feet below them with a critically injured patient. The transfer would have to be executed perfectly, with no room for error. "Affirmative, Rodriguez. I'll need another 20 minutes to reach transfer position." The final section of the ascent was the most technically demanding. Sarah had to navigate a series of overhanging ice formations while managing Eleanor's weight and preparing for the transfer to the main rescue team. Her own exhaustion was becoming a serious factor, and she found herself relying more heavily on mechanical advantage systems to compensate for her declining strength. As she approached the transfer point, Sarah could see the main rescue team working frantically to set up their own hall system. Rodriguez was there, along with Wilson, Martinez, and several other team members she recognized. They had managed to reach the ridge in less than 4 hours, an impressive achievement given the weather conditions. The transfer process required precise coordination between Sarah and the team above. Eleanor's weight had to be shifted from Sarah's system to the main rescue hall without any loss of security or control. If something went wrong during the transfer, the unconscious woman could fall back into the crevasse. Sarah rigged the transfer carefully, using redundant safety systems to ensure that Eleanor would remain secure even if primary systems failed. The woman was still unconscious, her breathing shallow and irregular, but she was alive. Getting her to the top and into the hands of the medical team was now the priority. "Ready for transfer," Sarah called up to the team. "Copy that. Transferring weight in 3, 2, 1, mark." Eleanor's weight shifted to the main hall system, and Sarah felt a moment of relief as the responsibility transferred to the full rescue team. They began raising the unconscious woman immediately, their mechanical advantage system making quick work of the remaining distance. But Sarah's job was far from over. David was still trapped in the unstable aircraft at the bottom of the crevasse, and the plane had been shifting position continuously during her absence. She began her descent back to the crash site, rappelling down the route she had just climbed, while the team above worked to get Eleanor to safety. The return trip to the aircraft revealed the extent of the plane's deterioration. The wreckage had shifted significantly during the hour she'd been gone, sliding almost 10 feet deeper into the crevasse. The tail section was now completely unsupported, hanging over what appeared to be a bottomless drop. David was trapped in an aircraft that could fall away beneath him at any moment. "David, how are you holding up?" Sarah called as she reached the level of the cockpit. "Been better," he replied, but his voice was weaker than before. The extended time in the cold had taken its toll, and Sarah could see that his condition had deteriorated significantly. His speech was slightly slurred, and his movements were slower and less coordinated. He was showing early signs of hypothermia. Himself, the extraction of David presented different challenges than Eleanor's rescue. He was conscious and mobile, which meant he could assist in his own evacuation. But the aircraft was now so unstable that any significant movement might cause it to fall. Sarah would have to get him out quickly and efficiently, with no margin for error. She began rigging David's rescue harness while the plane groaned ominously around them. Every few minutes, another gust of wind would cause the wreckage to shift slightly, accompanied by the sound of metal stress and ice cracking. The aircraft was literally falling apart beneath them. "Sarah," David said quietly as she worked, "I need you to know something. If this doesn't work, if something happens to me, Make sure someone tells my wife that I was thinking about her. Tell her I love her." Sarah paused in her rigging to look at him directly. "You're going to tell her yourself, David. We're getting you out of here." "I hope so. But just in case." The sincerity in his voice reminded Sarah of the human cost. A failure. This wasn't just a technical rescue exercise or a test of her climbing skills. David Walsh was a real person with a real family who would be devastated if she failed. The weight of that responsibility was almost overwhelming. She finished rigging his harness and began the extraction process. David was able to help significantly, using his good arm to support his own weight and coordinate his movements with her instructions. The process went much faster than Eleanor's extraction, but it was no less dangerous given the instability of the aircraft. As David cleared the cockpit, the plane shuddered and dropped another few feet into the crevasse. The tail section broke away completely, tumbling into the darkness below with a sound like thunder. They had evacuated him with literally seconds to spare. The ascent with David was different from the earlier climb with Eleanor. He was conscious and able to assist, which made the rope work easier, but introduced new complications. David had never done technical climbing before, and the exposure and physical demands of the ascent were terrifying for someone without experience. Sarah had to coach him through every movement while managing the complex rope systems and fighting the continuing storm. "Don't look down," she advised as they climbed. "Focus on the ice in front of you, on the next handhold, the next step. We're going to take this one move at a time." David followed her instructions precisely, showing remarkable composure for someone who had never been in such an extreme situation. His broken arm limited his mobility significantly, but he found ways to contribute to his own rescue that reduced the load on Sarah's systems. The radio crackled with updates from the team above. Eleanor had reached the surface and was being treated for severe hypothermia. Her condition was critical but stable, and they were preparing to evacuate her to the hospital as soon as the weather allowed helicopter operations to resume. "Sarah, this is Rodriguez. We're tracking your progress. ETA to the top?" "Approximately 30 minutes, Sarah responded. "Patient is mobile and assisting. Condition stable, but showing signs of hypothermia and possible concussion." "Copy that. Medical team is standing by." The final stages of David's rescue proceeded smoothly despite the challenging conditions. The main rescue team was able to assist with the haul systems once they reached the upper sections of the face, reducing the physical demands on Sarah significantly. David's courage and determination impressed everyone involved in the operation. As they reached the ridge, strong hands pulled them both to safety. Sarah found herself surrounded by her teammates, people who had doubted her capabilities just hours earlier. The expressions on their faces had changed completely. Where she had once seen skepticism and condescension, she now saw respect and admiration. Rodriguez approached her as she unclipped from the rescue systems. "Sarah, what you did down there? I've been doing mountain rescue for 20 years, and I've never seen anything like it. That was a textbook technical rescue under impossible conditions." Wilson stepped forward, the senior rescue specialist who had dismissed her experience. "Just hours earlier. I owe you an apology, Sarah. I was wrong about your capabilities. What you accomplished tonight proves that you belong on this team." Sarah was too exhausted to feel vindicated or satisfied by their acknowledgments. All she could think about was whether Eleanor would survive her injuries and whether David would recover fully from his ordeal. The technical success of the rescue meant nothing if the patients didn't survive. The team worked together to package both patients for evacuation, using emergency shelters and heating systems to begin the rewarming process. Eleanor remained unconscious, but her vital signs were stabilizing. David was alert and responsive, though clearly suffering from exhaustion and exposure. As the storm began to show signs of weakening, Rodriguez made the decision to call for helicopter evacuation. The patients needed advanced medical care that couldn't be provided in the field, and time was still critical for Eleanor's recovery. The helicopter crew would have to execute a challenging landing in marginal weather conditions, but it was a risk worth taking. Sarah helped prepare the landing zone, using her remaining energy to clear snow and set up approach lights for the final incoming aircraft. The physical demands of the rescue had pushed her beyond her normal limits, but adrenaline and determination kept her functioning. The helicopter arrived as the first hints of dawn began to appear through the storm clouds. The crew executed a perfect landing despite the challenging conditions, and Eleanor and David were loaded aboard within minutes. Sarah watched the aircraft disappear into the gray morning sky, carrying two people whose lives had depended entirely on her skills and determination. As the helicopter faded from view, Sarah finally allowed herself to feel the full impact of what had occurred. She had defied direct orders, attempted a rescue that everyone considered impossible, and succeeded against overwhelming odds. 2. People were alive because she had refused to accept the limitations that others had placed on her abilities. But the personal cost was significant. She had risked her career, her relationships with her teammates, and her own life to prove a point. The rescue had been successful, but she still faced the consequences of her insubordination. Rodriguez would have to file a report, and there would certainly be an investigation into her actions. The team began the long hike back to the trailhead, their movements slow and deliberate after the adrenaline-fueled intensity of the rescue operation. Sarah walked in silence, processing the events of the night and trying to understand how everything had changed so dramatically in just a few hours. As they descended through the forest, Tom Wilson fell into step beside her. "Sarah, I need you. To know that what happened tonight changes everything. You've proven yourself in the most demanding circumstances imaginable. When we get back, I'm going to recommend you for immediate certification in all technical rescue specialties." Sarah nodded but didn't respond immediately. The validation she had sought for 3 years was finally being offered, but it felt different than she had expected. The respect of her teammates was meaningful, but it had come at a tremendous personal cost. "Thank you, Tom. That means a lot. You saved 2 lives tonight, Sarah. Lives that would have been lost if you hadn't been willing to take that risk. Don't ever doubt the value of what you accomplished." As they reached the trailhead, Sarah could see news vehicles arriving, their satellite dishes and camera crews, preparing to document the story of the dramatic rescue. The media attention would complicate everything, turning a professional mountain rescue operation into a public spectacle. Rodriguez gathered the team together before they encountered the reporters. "What happened tonight stays within this team until the official debriefing is complete. Sarah, you're going to face a lot of questions about your decision to proceed without authorization. I'll support your actions in my report, but you need to be prepared for an investigation." Sarah understood the implications. Her career could still be in jeopardy despite the successful outcome of the rescue. Success didn't automatically justify insubordination, and there would be officials who would want to make an example of her actions. But as she looked back toward the mountain where she had spent the night fighting for 2 strangers' lives, Sarah felt a deep sense of satisfaction. She had proven to herself and to others that she belonged in mountain rescue. The bureaucratic consequences seemed less important than the fundamental truth that had been established. The storm was finally breaking as they reached the parking area, revealing clear skies and brilliant morning sunlight. The mountain looked peaceful and beautiful, showing no signs of the drama that had unfolded in its hidden crevasses. Sarah climbed into Rodriguez's truck for the ride back to headquarters, knowing that everything about her life was about to change. David Walsh and Eleanor Martinez were alive because she had refused to accept limitations placed on her by others. The technical rescue had been flawless, executed under some of the most challenging conditions any mountain rescue team had ever faced. She had proven her capabilities beyond any reasonable doubt. But the real test was just beginning. Chen had shown that she could perform under pressure, but now she would have to navigate the complex political and professional consequences of her actions. The next few days would determine whether her career in mountain rescue would continue, or whether her moment of triumph would also be her downfall. The mountain had tested her skills and found them sufficient. Now society would test her character and determine her fate. The conference room at Mount Baker Search and Rescue Headquarters buzzed with tension as Sarah faced a panel of officials who would determine her professional future. 3 days had passed since the Glacier rescue, and the media storm had only intensified. News outlets across the Pacific Northwest were calling her a hero, but the faces around the polished oak table suggested that heroism and protocol violations were not mutually exclusive in the eyes of the administration. Regional Director Amanda Foster sat at the head of the table, her expression unreadable as she reviewed the thick file of reports and testimonies. Beside her, State Emergency Management Coordinator Robert Nash drummed his fingers impatiently, clearly eager to address what he perceived as a dangerous precedent of insubordination. The third panel member, Dr. Elizabeth Warren from the State Medical Examiner's Office, had been reviewing the medical aspects of the rescue with clinical detachment. Sarah sat across from them in her dress uniform, the same crisp blue shirt and tactical pants that she had worn during her initial interview 3 years ago. The irony was not lost on her that she was once again fighting for her place on the team, but this time the stakes were different. Eleanor Martinez and David Walsh were alive and recovering in Seattle hospitals, their survival standing as tangible proof of her capabilities. Rodriguez entered the room carrying a manila folder thick with documentation. As the incident commander, his testimony would carry significant weight in determining the outcome of the investigation. Sarah had worked closely with him for 3 years, but she couldn't read his expression as he took his seat at the witness table. Foster opened the proceedings with bureaucratic precision. This hearing is convened to investigate the actions of search and rescue specialist Sarah Chen during the aircraft emergency response on January 15th. Specialist Chen, you are accused of willful disobedience of direct orders, unauthorized deployment of rescue resources, and reckless endangerment of personnel and equipment. The formal charges hung in the air like a physical weight. Sarah had expected this moment, but hearing the accusations spoken aloud made them feel more real and more threatening. Her entire career hinged on the next few hours of testimony and deliberation. Nash leaned forward aggressively. Specialist Chen, let's cut through the heroics and focus on facts. You deliberately disobeyed direct orders from your commanding officer and proceeded with an unauthorized rescue operation. How do you justify this clear violation of chain of command? Sarah had rehearsed her response, but facing the actual panel required her to find reserves of composure she hadn't known she possessed. Sir, I believe that the authorized response plan would result in the deaths of both crash victims. The 6-hour timeline for the standard approach would have exceeded the survivability window for severe hypothermia patients. Foster interrupted before Nash could respond. Specialist Chen, your beliefs about medical timelines don't override established command structure. You're not qualified to make tactical decisions that contradict your superior officers. The criticism stung because it echoed the same dismissive attitude Sarah had faced throughout her career. Her technical qualifications and training seemed to matter less than her position in the organizational hierarchy. She realized that this hearing was about more than just her actions during the rescue. It was about challenging the fundamental assumptions of how the system operated. Dr. Warren spoke for the first time, her voice carrying the authority of medical expertise. Actually, Specialist Chen's assessment of the medical timeline appears to have been accurate. Both patients presented with severe hypothermia that would likely have progressed to fatal stages within the time frame of the standard rescue approach. Nash's expression darkened. Doctor, that's purely speculative. We can't base policy decisions on hypothetical outcomes. Warren's response was crisp and professional. "It's not speculative. Coordinator Nash, Eleanor Martinez had a core body temperature of 84 degrees when she reached the hospital. Medical literature clearly indicates that survival rates drop precipitously after 6 hours of exposure at that level of hypothermia. The timeline factors are well established." Sarah felt a surge of gratitude toward the medical examiner, who was providing objective validation of her tactical assessment. But she also understood that the hearing was about more than medical facts. The panel was evaluating whether the organization could function if individual members were allowed to override authority based on their personal judgment. Rodriguez was called to provide his perspective as incident commander. Sarah watched carefully as her captain approached the witness position, knowing that his testimony could either vindicate her actions or destroy her career. Their relationship had been complex throughout her tenure with the team, marked by mutual respect but also by his protective instincts that had often kept her from major assignments. Foster addressed Rodriguez directly. "Captain, please describe your interaction with Specialist Chen during the emergency response." Rodriguez cleared his throat, choosing his words carefully. "Specialist Chen requested permission to attempt the north face approach to the crash site. I denied that request based on safety considerations and her lack of certification for Glacier rescue operations." Nash seized on this testimony. "And did Specialist Chen accept your decision and follow orders?" "No, sir. She proceeded with the unauthorized operation despite direct orders to stand down." Sarah's heart sank as she heard her commanding officer confirm the central accusation against her. The factual basis for insubordination was undeniable, regardless of the outcome of her actions, but Rodriguez wasn't finished. "However, I need to provide additional context for the panel's consideration. Specialist Chen's technical assessment of the situation was completely accurate. The standard approach would have resulted in the deaths of both crash victims. Her route selection and execution were flawless under extremely challenging conditions." Foster raised an eyebrow. "Captain, are you suggesting that disobedience is acceptable if the outcome is successful?" Rodriguez paused for a long moment, and Sarah could see him weighing his response carefully. His next words could either support her or eliminate any chance of her continuing with the organization. "No, ma'am. I'm suggesting that Specialist Chen demonstrated exceptional judgment and technical expertise under conditions that exposed fundamental weaknesses in our standard operating procedures. Her actions saved 2 lives that would have been lost using our established protocols." Nash leaned back in his chair, clearly frustrated with the direction of the testimony. "Captain Rodriguez, surely you understand that we cannot have rescue personnel making independent tactical decisions based on their personal assessment of situations. That's a recipe for chaos and disaster. With respect, Coordinator Nash, we already had a disaster. 2 people were dying in a glacier crevasse while our standard procedures proved inadequate to the emergency. Specialist Chen identified a solution that our established systems couldn't provide." The tension in the room was palpable as Rodriguez's words challenged not just the specific accusations against Sarah, but the entire framework of how rescue operations were managed. Sarah realized that her captain was putting his own career at risk by defending her actions so forcefully. Dr. Warren requested permission to present additional medical evidence. She opened a laptop and projected patient data onto the screen at the front of the room. Eleanor Martinez's medical records painted a stark picture of how close she had come to death. Mrs. Martinez was admitted with severe hypothermia, cardiac arrhythmia, and multiple complications associated with prolonged cold exposure, Warren explained. The emergency room physician noted that she would likely have died within 60 to 90 minutes without intervention. The timeline of Specialist Chen's rescue operation placed her extraction well within that survival window. Warren advanced to the next slide, showing David Walsh's medical evaluation. Mr. Walsh presented with a compound fracture, mild concussion, and moderate hypothermia. His condition was stable but deteriorating. The medical assessment indicates that he could have survived perhaps 3 to 4 hours longer, but not the medical assessment indicates that he could have survived perhaps 3 to 4 hours longer. 6 hours required for the standard rescue approach. Nash studied the medical data with obvious discomfort. The objective evidence supported Sarah's tactical decision, undermining his position that protocol should supersede individual judgment. But he wasn't prepared to concede the broader principle. Dr. Warren, even accepting your medical assessment, we cannot establish rescue policy based on exceptional circumstances. Our procedures exist to protect both victims and rescue personnel across a wide range of scenarios. Foster nodded in agreement. The coordinator raises a valid point. How do we balance the need for tactical flexibility with the requirement for organizational discipline? Sarah realized that this was her moment to speak, to articulate not just her actions, but her vision for how mountain rescue could evolve to meet modern challenges. She stood up, drawing the attention of everyone in the room. May I address the panel directly? Foster gestured for her to proceed. You may speak, Specialist Chen. Sarah took a deep breath, knowing that her next words would either vindicate 3 years of struggle or end her career in mountain rescue. Members of the panel, I understand the importance of following orders and maintaining organizational discipline. But I also understand that our primary mission is saving lives, not following procedures. She paused, gathering her thoughts before continuing. 3 days ago, 2 people were dying while our standard operating procedures were inadequate to help them. I had the training, the equipment, and the capability to save their lives, but I was prevented from acting because I hadn't been given official permission to use those capabilities. Nash interrupted. Specialist Chen, you lack the experience and certification required for Glacier rescue operations. Your training doesn't qualify you to make those tactical decisions. Sarah turned to face him directly. Coordinator Nash, with respect, Eleanor Martinez and David Walsh are alive today because my training was exactly what the situation required. The question isn't whether I was qualified to attempt the rescue. The question is whether we're going to let bureaucratic procedures prevent us from using our best capabilities when lives are at stake. The room fell silent as the implications of her statement sank in. Sarah was challenging not just the specific decisions that had been made during the emergency, but the entire culture of risk aversion that had shaped her career. Foster leaned forward. Specialist Chen, what you're suggesting sounds like a justification for ignoring authority whenever someone believes they know better. How would we maintain any organizational structure under those circumstances? Sarah had anticipated this question, and her response reflected years of thinking about the balance between individual capability and organizational requirements. Director Foster, I'm not advocating for ignoring authority. I'm advocating for recognizing capability and making tactical decisions based on the best available resources rather than the most politically acceptable ones. She gestured toward the medical data still displayed on the screen. Dr. Warren's evidence proves that my assessment was correct and that the standard approach would have failed. The question is whether we learn from this experience and adapt our procedures, or whether we punish success because it didn't follow the prescribed format. Rodriguez requested permission to add additional testimony. If I may, Director Foster, I'd like to address the organizational implications of Specialist Chen's actions. Foster nodded for him to continue. In my 20 years of mountain rescue experience, I've seen numerous situations where rigid adherence to procedure resulted in preventable deaths. I've also seen situations where flexible tactical thinking saved lives that would have been lost using standard approaches. Specialist Chen's actions represent the kind of adaptive leadership that our organization needs to develop. Nash was clearly growing frustrated with the direction of the testimony. Captain Rodriguez, you're essentially arguing that we should Abandon established procedures whenever someone believes they have a better idea. That's not leadership. That's anarchy. Rodriguez shook his head. No, sir. I'm arguing that we should recognize exceptional capability when it exists and find ways to utilize it effectively. Specialist Chen has demonstrated technical skills that exceed those of most veteran rescue personnel. Suppressing those capabilities because they don't fit our traditional organizational model serves no one. Dr. Warren added her perspective to the discussion. From a medical standpoint, the outcome speaks for itself. Both patients received optimal care under circumstances that would have been fatal using standard procedures. The innovative approach resulted in the best possible medical outcome. Foster called for a brief recess to allow the panel to discuss the testimony privately. Sarah remained in the conference room, surrounded by the weight of 3 years of struggle and the uncertainty of what lay ahead. Rodriguez approached her during the break. Sarah, regardless of how this hearing concludes, I want you to know that what you accomplished was extraordinary. You've changed how I think about capability and organizational structure. Sarah appreciated his support, but she also understood the larger implications of the situation. If the panel ruled against her, it would send a message that innovative thinking and exceptional performance were less valuable than organizational compliance. If they supported her actions, it would require them to acknowledge fundamental flaws in their current operating procedures. When the panel reconvened, Foster's expression revealed nothing about their private deliberations. After reviewing all testimony and evidence, this panel has reached several conclusions regarding Specialist Chen's actions during the aircraft emergency response. Sarah felt her heart racing as she prepared to learn her fate. 3 years of training, 3 days of media attention, and 2 lives saved had led to this moment of bureaucratic judgment. Foster continued with formal precision. First, we find that Specialist Chen did willfully disobey direct orders from her commanding officer. This violation of chain of command cannot be overlooked regardless of the outcome of her actions. Sarah's stomach dropped as she heard the confirmation of the primary charge against her. But Foster wasn't finished. Second, we find that Specialist Chen's technical assessment of the emergency situation was accurate, and that her chosen approach was the only viable option for saving both crash victims. The medical evidence supports her tactical decision-making. Nash shifted uncomfortably as Foster delivered the panel's third finding. We also conclude that current organizational procedures were inadequate to address the specific emergency circumstances, and that Specialist Chen's capabilities were not being utilized effectively due to bureaucratic limitations rather than technical deficiencies. The room was completely silent as Foster prepared to announce the panel's decision. Sarah realized she was holding her breath, waiting to learn whether her career would continue or end. Therefore, this panel recommends the following actions. Specialist Chen will receive an official reprimand for violation of direct orders to be placed in her permanent personnel file. However, she will also receive immediate certification for all technical rescue specialties and promotion to senior rescue specialist with expanded tactical authority. Sarah felt a wave of relief mixed with vindication. The panel had found a way to acknowledge both her violation of procedure and her exceptional performance. The reprimand would serve as a formal recognition of her insubordination, while the promotion and certifications would validate her capabilities. Nash looked surprised by the decision. Director Foster, how do we justify promoting someone who has just been found guilty of disobeying orders? Foster's response revealed the complexity of balancing organizational discipline with operational effectiveness. Coordinator Nash, we promote her because she demonstrated exceptional judgment and technical expertise under the most challenging circumstances imaginable. The reprimand addresses the procedural violation. The promotion addresses the capability we nearly lost due to bureaucratic inflexibility. Rodriguez smiled as the implications of the decision became clear. Sarah would not only remain with the team, but would be recognized as one of their most capable technical specialists. Her 3-year struggle for acceptance had concluded with validation of everything she had been trying to prove. Dr. Warren closed her laptop, satisfied that the medical evidence had influenced the panel's decision appropriately. If I may add a final observation, Specialist Chen's actions provide a case study in how technical expertise and innovative thinking can overcome institutional limitations. This hearing has implications beyond just personnel decisions. Foster nodded in agreement. The panel also recommends a comprehensive review of standard operating procedures to ensure that capable personnel are not prevented from utilizing their skills due to bureaucratic constraints. Specialist Chen's experience suggests that our current system may be inadvertently limiting our operational effectiveness. As the hearing concluded and the panel members gathered their materials, Sarah felt a profound sense of completion. The validation she had sought for 3 years had finally been achieved, but it had come through challenging the very system she had wanted to join. Her place on the team was now secure, but it had been earned by proving that sometimes the system itself needed to change. Rodriguez approached her as they left the conference room. "Sarah, you've not only secured your own future, but you've probably changed how this organization operates. That's a significant accomplishment." Sarah smiled, thinking about Eleanor Martinez and David Walsh, who were recovering in Seattle hospitals. Thanks to a rescue operation that had defied conventional wisdom, their survival had provided the ultimate validation of her capabilities and her judgment. Outside the headquarters building, the media crews were still waiting for statements about the hearing's outcome. Sarah realized that her story had become more than just a personal struggle for recognition. It had become a symbol of how individual capability could challenge institutional limitations. As she walked toward her truck, Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message from David Walsh. "Saw the news about your hearing. Eleanor and I can't thank you enough for what you did. You saved our lives when everyone else said it was impossible." Sarah looked back at the Mount Baker Search and Rescue Headquarters, where she had fought for 3 years to prove her worth. The building looked the same, but everything about her relationship with it had changed. She was no longer the outsider, trying to gain acceptance. She was now one of the organization's most respected technical specialists, with the authority and responsibility that came with that recognition. The mountain peaks visible in the distance reminded her of the Glacier crevasse where she had rappelled down to save 2 strangers. That rescue had required every skill she possessed, and some she had improvised on the spot. But more than technical expertise, it had required the courage to trust her own judgment when everyone else doubted her capabilities. Sarah Chen drove home through the Pacific Northwest landscape, knowing that her life had been fundamentally transformed by 3 days of controversy and a lifetime of preparation. She had proven that sometimes the most unlikely person is exactly who you need when everything is on the line, and that recognition of capability matters more than adherence to conventional expectations. The mountains that had tested her skills and validated her judgment stood silent under the afternoon sky, keeping their secrets about the rescue that had changed everything. But Sarah knew she would return to those peaks again and again, because that was where she belonged, where she had always belonged, where her capabilities could serve their highest purpose of saving lives that others couldn't reach. 6 months later, Sarah stood on the observation deck of Seattle Medical Center, watching Eleanor Martinez take her first steps without assistance since the crash. The 73-year-old woman moved slowly but deliberately down the rehabilitation unit's hallway, her granddaughter Emma walking beside her with encouraging words. The sight filled Sarah with a profound sense of completion that no official recognition could match. Eleanor had spent 2 months in intensive care, battling the complications of severe hypothermia, and the doctors had warned that she might never walk again. But the determination that had carried her through decades as a rural teacher had served her well during the long recovery process. Her survival represented more than just medical success. It validated every risk Sarah had taken during that storm-lashed night on the glacier. David Walsh appeared at Sarah's elbow, his left arm still in a supportive brace, but otherwise showing no signs of his ordeal. The pilot had recovered quickly from his injuries and had returned to flying just 3 months after the crash. His presence at Eleanor's rehabilitation session spoke to the bond that had formed between the 3 survivors of that night. "She's incredible," David said quietly, watching Eleanor navigate the hallway with stubborn independence. "The doctor said her brain function might be permanently affected by the hypothermia, but look at her. Sharp as ever." Sarah smiled, remembering the unconscious woman she had extracted from the crumpled aircraft. The contrast between that desperate night and this moment of triumph illustrated the profound impact that split-second decisions could have on human lives. Eleanor's recovery had become a symbol of hope for the entire medical team treating hypothermia patients. Eleanor noticed Sarah watching and approached the observation window with a determined smile. Despite her age and the trauma she had endured, her eyes retained the spark of intelligence and humor that had made her a beloved educator for 40 years. She gestured for Sarah to join her in the hallway. "Sarah Chen," Eleanor said with mock sternness as they embraced, "I have a bone to pick with you." Sarah raised an eyebrow, wondering what complaint the elderly woman might have about her rescue. Eleanor's stern expression dissolved into a grin. "You saved my life before I had a chance to properly thank you. Do you have any idea how rude that is?" The laughter that followed felt like a release of tension that Sarah hadn't realized she'd been carrying. The technical success of the rescue had been validated by official recognition, but Eleanor's humor and vitality provided something more meaningful, proof that her actions had preserved not just life, but the fullness of human experience. Emma Martinez Johnson, Eleanor's granddaughter, approached with a small wrapped package. The young woman had driven from Portland every weekend during her grandmother's recovery, and her gratitude towards Sarah had been expressed in countless small gestures over the months. "Sarah, Grandma wanted to give this to you herself," Emma said, handing over the carefully wrapped gift. Sarah opened the package to reveal a hand-carved wooden compass, its brass face gleaming with careful polishing. The inscription on the back read, "To Sarah Chen, true north when others lose their way. With love and gratitude, Eleanor Martinez." The gift was beautiful in its simplicity, but its meaning resonated far beyond its craftsmanship. Sarah had spent years trying to prove that she belonged in mountain rescue, fighting against perceptions and limitations imposed by others. Eleanor's compass represented recognition of something deeper, the moral courage to do what was right, regardless of consequences. David pulled out his phone to show Sarah a photo from his recent flying assignment. "I wanted you to see this," he said, displaying an aerial view of the Devil's Backbone Glacier system. "I flew over the crash site last week during a medical transport mission. The whole area where the plane went down has shifted. That crevasse doesn't even exist anymore." Sarah studied the photograph, noting how the ice formations had completely changed. Glaciers were constantly moving, constantly reshaping themselves, and the specific terrain features that had defined her rescue route were now part of the mountain's history. The transient nature of the landscape made her achievement feel even more remarkable. The 3 of them walked together toward the hospital's main lobby, where a small celebration was planned for Eleanor's discharge. Hospital staff, family members, and several of Sarah's rescue team colleagues had gathered to mark the milestone. Rodriguez was there, along with Wilson and Martinez, all of them eager to celebrate not just Eleanor's recovery, but the validation of the unconventional rescue that had made it possible. Dr. Patricia Kim, the hypothermia specialist who had treated Eleanor, approached Sarah with obvious enthusiasm. "I've been following your career since the rescue," she said. "Your quick extraction and field treatment probably added years to Mrs. Martinez's life." The medical literature on extreme hypothermia rarely includes cases with such positive outcomes. Sarah appreciated the medical validation, but her attention was drawn to a group of young paramedics who had gathered near the lobby entrance. They were clearly eager to meet her, their faces showing the mixture of admiration and curiosity that she had encountered frequently since the rescue became public knowledge. One of the paramedics, a young woman who couldn't have been more than 25, stepped forward nervously. "Miss Chen, I'm Jessica Torres with County Emergency Services. I've been following your story, and I wanted to ask about your training approach. How did you develop the skills for that type of technical rescue?" The question reminded Sarah of her own early career, when she had been eager for mentorship and guidance from experienced professionals. The irony was not lost on her that she was now seen as someone whose experience could guide others, despite having fought for recognition for so long. The technical skills came from constant practice and seeking out the best training available, Sarah replied. But the real preparation was mental. Learning to trust your assessment of situations even when others doubt your judgment. Jessica nodded earnestly, clearly absorbing every word. "The news reports said you went against orders. How do you know when to follow protocol and when to think independently?" Sarah paused, considering how to articulate lessons that had cost her years of struggle to learn. Protocol exists for good reasons, and most of the time following established procedures is the right approach. But when lives are at stake and you have the capability to save them, you have to be willing to accept responsibility for your decisions. Rodriguez joined the conversation, adding his perspective as someone who had witnessed Sarah's evolution from persistent rookie to respected specialist. What Sarah demonstrated is the difference between reckless independence and informed judgment. She had the skills, the preparation, and the situational awareness to make that rescue work. The celebration continued for another hour with hospital staff sharing updates on Eleanor's remarkable recovery and rescue, team members discussing how the incident had influenced their approach to training and deployment. Sarah found herself at the center of conversations that felt surreal compared to her previous experience of being marginalized and dismissed. As the gathering wound down, Eleanor asked Sarah to walk with her to the hospital parking garage. Despite her age and recent ordeal, the elderly woman moved with purpose and determination that reminded Sarah why she had fought so hard to save her life. "Sarah, I need to tell you something that I haven't shared with anyone else," Eleanor said as they reached her granddaughter's car. "I was conscious for part of the time after the crash. I heard you talking to David, heard you planning the rescue. I knew how dangerous it was." Sarah was surprised by this revelation. The medical reports had indicated that Eleanor had been unconscious from the impact until she reached the hospital. Eleanor continued, her voice carrying the weight of deep gratitude. "I heard you tell David that you were going to get me out first because my condition was more critical. You risked everything to save an old woman you'd never met, someone who might not have had many years left anyway." The comment touched something fundamental in Sarah's understanding of her own motivations. She had never calculated the value of the lives she was trying to save. She had simply recognized people in need and used her capabilities to help them. "Mrs. Martinez, age doesn't determine the value of a life. You've touched thousands of students during your teaching career. Your experience and wisdom are irreplaceable." Eleanor smiled, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "That's exactly why you're the person who should have made that rescue. Not because of your technical skills, though they're impressive, because you understand what really matters." As Eleanor settled into the passenger seat of her granddaughter's car, she handed Sarah a manila envelope. "This is a letter I've written to the State Emergency Management Department. I'm recommending changes to rescue protocols based on what I witnessed during our emergency. Sometimes it takes an outsider's perspective to see what needs to be fixed." Sarah accepted the envelope, understanding that Eleanor's advocacy represented another form of validation. The people she had saved were now working to ensure that others in similar situations would receive the same level of innovative response. David Walsh approached as Eleanor's car pulled away, his expression thoughtful. "Sarah, I've been thinking about what happened that night, about the decisions you made under pressure. I'm a pilot, so I understand calculated risks, but what you did was something else entirely." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "You saw a situation where conventional wisdom said success was impossible, and you found a way to make it work anyway. That's the kind of thinking that pushes boundaries and saves lives." Sarah appreciated his perspective, especially coming from someone whose professional life involved making critical decisions under pressure. David's recovery and return to flying represented another positive outcome from that night's events. As she drove home through the Seattle suburbs, Sarah reflected on how dramatically her life had changed since the Glacier rescue. The official recognition and promotion had opened doors that had been closed for years, but the personal satisfaction came from knowing that her capabilities were finally being utilized effectively. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Rodriguez. "New team member starting Monday. Young guy, lots of enthusiasm, reminds me of someone I know. Could use a mentor with experience in unconventional problem solving." Sarah smiled, understanding the implication. She was being asked to guide the next generation of rescue specialists, to share the lessons she had learned about balancing technical excellence with organizational dynamics. The prospect of mentoring others felt like a natural evolution of her own journey. The mountains visible through her windshield looked peaceful in the afternoon sunlight, showing no signs of the drama that had unfolded in their hidden crevasses months earlier. But Sarah knew that somewhere in those peaks, other emergencies were waiting, other opportunities to push the boundaries of what was considered possible. Her career in mountain rescue had begun with a desire to prove herself worthy of inclusion. It had evolved into something more meaningful, a commitment to using her capabilities in service of saving lives that others couldn't reach. The recognition and respect she had sought for so long were now secondary to the deeper satisfaction of knowing her place in the world. Sarah pulled into her driveway as the sun was setting behind the Cascade Range, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple. The compass that Eleanor had given her sat on the passenger seat, its brass face reflecting the evening light. True north when others lose their way. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to mentor young rescue specialists, new chances to refine techniques and push the boundaries of what mountain rescue could accomplish. But tonight, Sarah Chen was simply a woman who had found her place in the world by refusing to accept the limitations that others had tried to impose on her capabilities. The mountains that had tested her and ultimately validated her stood silent against the darkening sky, keeping their secrets about the rescue that had changed everything. But Sarah knew she belonged among those peaks, not as someone fighting for acceptance, but as someone whose presence made the difference between life and death for people who needed help the most. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.